Is Outer Dark Cormac McCarthy's best novel? And I can feel through the screen right now some people twitching a little bit because most certainly you do not believe Outer Dark is McCarthy's best novel. But I can also guarantee that a lot of you guys listening right now have not read Outer Dark because compared to Blood Meridian, for instance, Outer Dark has barely been read. Compared to The Road, Outer Dark is a drop in the ocean, And even one of McCarthy's other southern novels, Child of God, has been read at least twice as much as Outer Dark. And why is that? Why is there this hate for Cormac McCarthy's southern novels? And in my humble opinion, it's because a lot of us have not been trained and kind of gained the acquired taste of Southern Gothic literature. We all have probably read a Flannery O'Connor short story in high school or in college or just in your independent reading. Maybe you've read a novel by Faulkner, but the Southern Gothic genre for a couple decades was a very big deal. But then Faulkner and O'Connor died within a couple years' time, and postmodernism and novels about suburbia and cities started to explode because obviously the postmodern movement, but the National Endowment for Arts and MFA program started to explode in the 1960s, and an exponential amount more of books started to get published. You know, if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, there were only at most a couple dozen major literary fiction or poetry books released a year. But as you start moving into the 60s and the 70s, we're looking at hundreds or even thousands of books that are competing in this small genre. And so when you have someone like Cormac McCarthy, who was making his name in the early 1960s in the Southern Gothic genre, it's a pretty unrealistic pursuit because much like today, many of us are inundated with the idea of a Western. We get it. That's why McCarthy decided to start writing Westerns, because he said that people in Mongolia know about cowboys and Indians. People in Mongolia have no idea what the hell Southern Gothic is. And the Southern Gothic genre deals with a lot of uncomfortable tropes. For instance, in Outer Dark, and I'm not really going to spoil anything about Outer Dark in this video, but the plot of the novel stems from a brother and sister having an incest baby, and then kind of everything unravels from there. And throughout the novel, McCarthy relies on biblical tropes, which include incest, scapegoating, and the idea of sins of the father in a more symbolically overt way than a lot of his other novels. Because in my opinion, Outer Dark encompasses the best elements of all of his Southern works. It has the aggressive, the symbolic, and the somewhat juvenile prose of The Orchard Keeper. It has the violence of Child of God. It has kind of the canvas of eccentric and odd characters and weird Southern landscapes that Suttree does. And it puts all of it in a pretty condensed novel that sits around 70,000 words. And it also overcomes a lot of the other Southern Gothic novels' weaknesses. Child of God is only 35,000 pages and was actually an offshoot of Outer Dark. McCarthy was super broke and his wife was starting to nag him. And he decided that this part of Outer Dark that he was going to cut could be combined with this historical event that was happening in 1962 called the Lula Lake murders, and so that he could get an advance for this next novel, Child of God. And so later on, when he was talking to James Franco, and James asked him, like, why did you write this novel? And he was like, I don't know, like, it was kind of a dumb idea. And when you look at The Orchard Keeper, McCarthy was highly ambitious. He sent it to a slush pile at Random House, and it was pulled out. Something that you can never do today. Like, that just doesn't exist. And they hit him up and they're like, hey, we would love to publish you, but this is kind of a wonky novel. Like, we're going to have to make some changes and edits. And his reply back wasn't like, oh my God, thank you. His reply was that this novel is already perfect. And even though they made a lot of changes, The Orchard Keeper is a hard cookie to crack. Like, I made a 10-hour course on The Orchard Keeper and read it 15 times to really get the marrow out of the story. But you shouldn't have to do that with a 200-page novel about a bunch of dudes who don't like the government. You know, this is not Gravity's Rainbow. And Suttree can be too lengthy at times for a lot of readers. I've given Suttree to people who like Cormac McCarthy and I feel are esteemable intellectuals with an attention span, and they just couldn't get into it. I mean, and other people can. But but it kind of has a length and a plot issue because, if you've read Suttree, what the hell is the plot? But Outer Dark has a direct plot. It has characterization. It has a drive. And it stems from something psychically potent within McCarthy because the month McCarthy starts. So Outer Dark is also a really cool novel for Cormac McCarthy Studies because it is the only McCarthy novel where we have the first draft of it. So I've been to the Cormac McCarthy Archive in San Marcos, Texas, and read the first draft of Outer Dark. And it was started the month that his wife's first wife decided to leave him and take their child Colin to Wyoming. And she decided to leave because McCarthy and her met in, at the English department in English classes at the University of Tennessee. And she was a writer. She eventually got a fellowship at Stanford and published some books later in her life. And McCarthy got this deal with Random House, but didn't get very much money, like maybe $10,000 in today's money. And she was pregnant and working a full-time job, and she has the baby, and she says, hey man, can we split the workload? Can you get a job too so that, we can actually survive? And his response was, no, I'm going to sit and write, and you need to go get a second job. And she was like, you know what? You're a jerk. You're a douche, which he was, obviously. And she decided to leave. But the anxiety of her child and their child and his wife leaving really prompted Outer Dark. And I've compared it to David Lynch's Eraserhead, which kind of was, once again, a young man's contemplation and grappling with this idea of having kids and these things. And I know a lot of you guys are fathers or are going to be fathers in the future or are mothers, and it's a really big deal. We aren't unconscious beings back in the day. We have to contemplate the complexity and immensity of bringing another life into this world. And if you guys want to go deep into Outer Dark, I run an Outer Dark course, an Outer Dark book club, and daily office hours where you and I can talk about Outer Dark over on the Right Conscious Substack. We are starting our next round of the Right Conscious Book Club, and we are about to go absolutely crazy, everyone. If you look at this list of books, Gravity's Rainbow, The Passenger, Outer Dark, William T. Vollmann, Nabokov, Murakami, Bolaño, A Confederacy of the Dunces, we are embarking on probably the most ambitious book club process of realizing ourselves and our potential as writers through the greatest books of all time over there. And if you cannot make the book club calls, I record all the calls and post them. I have a weekly discussion post that you can always go back and post, and I'll reply to all your comments. And I host daily office hours where we can sit and talk about these books. And the Outer Dark course at this time is already 4 hours long, and I'm planning eventually to build it to over 10 hours within the next couple months as we read this book. And so if you are interested in my writing group, my book club, my Cormac McCarthy course, my David Foster Wallace course, and so much more, go check out the Right Conscious Substack. The link is down in the description below. And let me now continue to tell you why Outer Dark is Cormac McCarthy's best novel. And so as you guys just saw, we are also reading The Passenger, and The Passenger has supernatural elements within it. Alicia is either hallucinating or in contact with these kind of spirits, and one of them is called the Thalidomide Kid. But it is arguable in The Passenger that's just all a hallucination. When you go and read Blood Meridian, even though I personally believe Judge Holden is given kind of an archon or supernatural abilities within kind of the context of the book, one could argue, and I have people argue and comment all the time, that Judge Holden is just a man. He gets sunburned, all these different things. And we can have that debate, and I'd love to have it. But Outer Dark has the only, one could say, reliable and consistent kind of theme and characters of a supernatural ability of any Cormac McCarthy novel. And once again, that's kind of multiplied by the Southern genre. Most of us who've never been to the South and kind of interacted with it don't understand the immensity and the depths of those forests, the weirdness of the people who live there. Because when you look at the West, it wasn't really starting to be colonized and settled until the 1800s and, really until the mid to late 1800s. But Appalachia and the South got settled pretty early on. But unlike the Northeast, unlike kind of the upper levels of the Midwest, it was never really industrialized. A lot of the railroads and things didn't really come. The coal mines and these things didn't really come until pretty late into the game. And until, kind of the World War II war effort, which really pushed the industrialization with factories and stuff, the South was generally uninhabited. Cormac McCarthy's father worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority, and his job was to rip people off of their land in what is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and off of land that was going to be, destroyed through the building of dams. And those people, and McCarthy was traumatized by what his father was doing because a lot of them lived on this land without title. It had been multi-generational ancestral land that they had, but just never owned with the law. And so some people would get eminent domain money, but a lot of these people were just thrown off their land and got nothing from it. And McCarthy was actually one of these transplants. His family came from Rhode Island, and it was almost kind of like an early version of what is happening in the West right now. After COVID, everyone realized that they want to, drive around in a Sprinter van and go outside and post about it on Instagram. And now, housing prices in the West have just absolutely skyrocketed. And people also realize that they don't want to live in cities where, homelessness and lockdowns and crime are like a big deal. I'm currently in Wyoming, and I remember during the worst of the lockdowns and like the freakouts, the grocery store, the restaurants here, no masks. Everyone was just totally normal. You would think if you didn't watch the news, nothing was happening. Anyway, so there's kind of been an industrialization, commercialization and stuff of the West very recently. But in Appalachia, there's a great book titled Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. And he talks about this industrialization coming slowly, but surely. A Leviathan was crawling into the wilderness and was soon to consume it. And if you guys want if you guys want to learn more about this, which I'm sure you don't, and so I'll tell you, there's a great essay, though, called Commercial and Industrial Trends Since 1965 in Blount County by C.P. White, and he really details how Appalachia was hit harder by 20th century industrialization than anywhere else in the country. But what's cool about Outer Dark is that none of that exists, that in the novel, no technology is present. We actually don't know when it is. That's what's so wonky. We don't know actually where it is. It could be in, the North Carolina, Southern Virginia mountains, or East Tennessee, West Virginia. We don't know. People say it's in the early 1900s, but there is this eeriness and disconnectedness to the novel, that really lends itself well to the supernatural elements, that lends itself to helping you kind of get immersed in this Southern Gothicness, because many of us in kind of the Mormon and Protestant West, or the Catholic Northeast, or the Lutheran Midwest, didn't really get exposed, maybe more in the Northeast, to kind of some of the more pagan elements of American culture. In Cormac McCarthy's The Orchard Keeper, werecats, yes, you heard me right, not werewolves. Werecats are a big deal in the novel, probably one of the biggest symbols and moving factors of the plot and characterization. And that is a huge symbol in the South. When you look at New Orleans and Santeria and a lot of the native myths, it is a pretty vibrant place in terms of kind of screwed up things happening and screwed up symbols. And that's kind of at the core of Southern Gothic literature. And also, of course, kind of the insane Christianity. And at the start of Outer Dark, in the second paragraph, there is a dream. And this is why I won't spoil anything once again, but this kind of will give you guys a preview of kind of some of the nuances that McCarthy does in the novel. So at the start of the novel, McCarthy uses a framing device that continues throughout the rest of the novel, and it's a dream. And what happens in the dream, I won't tell you, but it has to do with scapegoating and the idea of crowds and civilization and at some level Christianity. And McCarthy reruns this same frame that happens in the dream and sets the tone of the novel again and again throughout the novel. Not overtly, but through a very similar sequence of events. And at the core of this theme is the Girardian idea of mimetic desire, mimetic violence. And if you aren't a Girardian or haven't looked into him yet, he dives into the pool of trying to figure out where our desires come from. Like, if you like Cormac McCarthy or reading or, big t-shirts, how did you get there? And he goes back to Christianity and connects a lot of it back to mimetic violence and rivalry and scapegoating. And from what I can tell, Outer Dark is one of the more beautiful examples of scapegoating and mimetic violence and mimetic rivalry I've ever seen in literature, because it's not overt. We're not he's not shoving it down our throat. But once you start to notice it, and over in the Outer Dark course, I'm actually going to have a Cormac McCarthy scholar come on soon who actually specializes in Girardian mimetic violence and applying it to Cormac McCarthy. But it helps you start to realize that it could be the core problem of human existence. Judge Holden rambling about violence and war and symbology and simulacra is really important. But most of us have, hopefully, I mean, I've talked to some of you guys out there and you guys are wild, but a lot of us have transcended violence in our own personal life and kind of the Nietzschean idea of, the abolition of morals. Hopefully we're past that. Many of us aren't living a Bildungs Roman in our life anymore. We're past the coming of age arc, and that kind of makes a lot of the Border trilogy irrelevant. It's fun to contemplate a dystopian future like The Road, but when you look at the world, when you look at politics and your relationships, in your life, in your own personal psychology, mimetic desire, mimetic violence, the cycle of scapegoating is one of the most relevant things that you can think about. And once you unlock that and start to study it, your life will change. You don't need a goddamn personal development book. You don't need a coach. You don't need to do a seminar. If you learn and read Rene Girard or understand Outer Dark, you're going to see how people have been fucking with you. You've been fucking with yourself, and you've been stuck in a cycle. And that's bigger of revelation than the environmentalism of the orchard keeper. Yeah, people suck and they screw up the land and don't care about it. Yeah, there are a bunch of crazy people like in Child of God or Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men, and it's going to continue to get worse. So what? That's really outside of our control. But the mimetic rivalries you're in with your wife, with your coworkers, that shit matters. And so let's go, everyone. Read the book. Buy the book. I don't care if you join the course. It doesn't matter. I want there to be an army of independent Cormac McCarthy scholars out there, because to get into the game, you need to read all of his books, because here I am not spoiling anything, not getting too deep, because I know a lot of you guys haven't read this yet. Once you guys are done, then nothing can be spoiled about McCarthy anymore. And you can start theorizing and shifting the direction to a more contemplative view of McCarthy's works. Because right now, go to the Cormac McCarthy subreddit. Here's my book collection. Judge Holden is Satan. And to end, the ending of Outer Dark is darker than maybe any other Cormac McCarthy novel. And so if you enjoy the darkness, if you enjoy screwed up shit, then Outer Dark is your book. And I haven't released my definitive rankings of Cormac McCarthy novels yet, but Outer Dark is most likely going to be near the top.